Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to go ahead and get things started. My name is Amy Jewett, and I am the Pennsylvania IMAP Invasives Program Coordinator at the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy and the Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program. And I'm pleased to be joined by Caitlin Seiler. She's with the Allegheny Land Trust. She's their Vice President of Stewardship. I'll be taking a moment to introduce her here in just a moment. The title of today's presentation is Preserving and Restoring a Floodplain Forest in the Face of Japanese Knotweed. So before we officially kick things off, I do want to mention there is a Q&A feature available to everyone. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, and also at the end, feel free to type those in, and we will then take some time at the very end of the presentation to go over any questions that come through. So I'll go ahead and introduce our guest speaker, Caitlin. So Caitlin Seiler is the Vice President of Stewardship for the Allegheny Land Trust, also known as ALT. She oversees the protection and management of all ALT protected lands. Her work involves upholding baseline land trust accreditation requirements for ALT's protected lands, developing management plans for ALT-owned conservation areas, and implementing restoration and improvement projects. Caitlin has been with the Allegheny Land Trust for nearly 10 years and started as a volunteer removing invasive species. She has overseen management of Sycamore Island since 2014. So thanks so much for being here today, Caitlin. I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to you.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining me. Let's dive in here. So with our time together today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Allegheny Land Trust and about our Sycamore Island Conservation Area, which is where we are conserving and restoring a floodplain forest and battling Japanese knotweed. I will share our invasive plant management strategy, how we're treating Japanese knotweed on the island, and how to approach your own invasive management. And as Amy mentioned, we'll have some time for questions. Allegheny Land Trust is an independent nonprofit formed in 1993. We focus on land conservation and stewardship in Allegheny County and its surrounding areas. We were formed in response to rapidly disappearing green space in the county, primarily through development. We permanently protect green space, which could look like 450 acres of unfragmented forest or 70 acres of forest untouched as part of a residential development plan. We also permanently protect important spaces in neighborhoods, like ensuring long-term protection of community gardens. We have an education team that provides environmental education programming in schools and in communities. We are a nationally accredited land trust, which means we uphold best management practices for land trusts. And we are one of 460 accredited land trusts throughout the US, 23 of which are in Pennsylvania. We protect over 3,700 acres in 27 different municipalities. As Amy mentioned, I am in our stewardship department, and I have been in our department for about 10 years. Stewardship involves developing management plans for all of our properties and implementing those plans to care for our lands by improving them to support healthy forests, wetlands, waterways. Also, where it's appropriate, we maintain the properties open for passive recreation. We have 2.5 staff in our department, and we rely greatly on the support of volunteers. Volunteer stewards who help to look after spaces individually, as well as volunteer groups who help out with work days and managing larger scale projects like dump site cleanups, tree plantings, trail building, knotweed cutting, that sort of thing. So Sycamore Island is 14 acres of floodplain forest located about 9 miles upriver of the point in downtown Pittsburgh on the Allegheny River. It's between Verona and Blonox. We permanently protected it in 2008, and we actually learned about this project through a for sale sign being posted on the island. Someone saw it and called us and told us about the opportunity. And through grant funding and donations, we were able to purchase it and permanently protect it as public green space. It has a floodplain forest, which according to our state natural heritage program, although they're not rare in Pennsylvania, they hold high conservation significance and have been displaced a lot through agriculture and development. Today, the island is open to the public from dawn till dusk, and it's accessible by boat only or your watercraft of choice. We also allow camping, overnight camping on the island with a permit through ALT in a designated camping area. As with much of the landscape in Western Pennsylvania, Sycamore Island has gone through some changes over the years, as has its neighbor, 9 Mile Island. So Sycamore Island is the larger island, kind of on the left side of the photos, and 9 Mile Island is on the right side. It was managed by a ski club, but now it's mainly conserved. So in 1938, you can see Sycamore Island was primarily covered with canopy, floodplain forest. And in the 1960s, it looks very different. It was developed for a marina. There was like a clubhouse on site, a pool, and you can see on the back channel, there are pilings where docks were boated. Boats were docked, sorry. On the lower half of the island, there is a barge. You can kind of see in the middle photo that barge cut off the southern tip of the island. And the barge is still there today. It was there for refueling, mainly refueling boats. So in 1972, Hurricane Agnes blew through and pretty much disrupted all of the development on the island, and the island was pretty much left there untouched for about 40 years before we protected it. So you can see in the 1973 photo where after all of the development, the island was kind of left for natural regeneration. When we protected the space, there were a lot of remnants of the old marina, like the pool and electrical poles, some fuel tanks were there. We were able to use some of the materials on site, and the pilings from the docks are still present in the back channel. So after Hurricane Agnes, as I said, the island was pretty much left on its own for natural regeneration, and it's done pretty well for itself in that time. You can see the northernmost tip of the island has very little canopy coverage on it, and it's got this like bright green growth, and that's all Japanese knotweed. As I mentioned, we develop management plans for every property that we own. We're required to do it for national accreditation, and it's also just a good idea to have some sort of plan written down for managing all the acreage. In some cases, we develop the plan internally, but at other times when we're working with a really unique space, or if the area incorporates things that are really out of our wheelhouse, we'll contract it out. So in 2010, Applied Ecological Services developed a master plan for us, which involved baseline assessments for wildlife, soil, and plant communities on the island. And they developed recommendations to manage the property for public access and recreation, incorporated recommendations for habitat restoration, and specific recommendations on invasive plant management. They identified several invasive species on the island and then ranked them in terms of need of management based on the size of their presence, the nature of the plant and their threat to the ecosystem, as well as the resources that would be required to manage those. So they listed them all and ranked them for us. And they had a separate full set of recommendations specific for Japanese knotweed because it was kind of present throughout the island, which you'll see in some upcoming maps here. So before I dive into the world of Japanese knotweed and what we're doing on Sycamore Island, just in case this is your first time ever hearing about invasive species, I just feel like I need to cover them real quick. They come in a variety of forms and are not just limited to plants, can include insects, fungi, birds, other animals. They have adapted certain growth and survival mechanisms that allow them to reproduce and spread quickly, which get out of control when they're taken out of their natural ecosystems. They're introduced to a new space somehow. Sometimes it's accidental, sometimes intentional, but without their natural systems in place to keep them in check, they're known to cause harm to the environment, economy, and health in spaces that they spread. So invasive plants all have similar qualities. They've all adapted to changing growing conditions. They grow quickly and spread rapidly. They outcompete other species and colonize disturbed spaces, so there's only one species growing. They outcompete natives for resources and decrease the biodiversity in an area, really offsetting the whole system that would naturally be in place in a biodiverse ecosystem. I think it's important to keep in mind that when we're talking about invasive species, we're not talking about an entity that has any malintent. And sometimes when we talk about invasive species and we use terms like exotic invaders, alien species, and talk about management in a way that's kind of, kill them all and wipe them out, I think sometimes it brings a lot of emotion and sometimes even violence into it. And whenever this information is widespread to the public, it can really have an aggressive tone and can launch people into action with kind of poor information. And although we're talking about bugs or plants, we're still talking about things that are just doing what they've been evolved to do. And that sometimes that aggression can translate over into discussions about other species. I know I've said some choice words when a lanternfly has flown right into my face, but when you're talking about invasive species management and thinking about management in your own spaces, I just think it's important to remain objective when you're setting your management goals and in managing invasive species. So we're here today to talk about Japanese knotweed. It has been used in traditional medicine for pain relief in Japan. It is native to Japan, and in its natural conditions, it actually grows on the side of active volcanoes. So, which is one reason why its growth patterns have been adapted to grow in harsh, changing conditions. We don't have a lot of active volcanoes or lava in Western PA, which is one reason why it can spread so aggressively here, especially along disturbed waterways. That's also why it has these growing traits that make it invasive once it escapes out of its natural space. It has a rhizome root system, which spreads and grows quickly in order to survive. And most of the plant's energy is within this rhizome system. So the roots grow out laterally and they grow straight down. And it's been described as operating like the battery of the plant. So all of the energy, or most of the energy of the plant, is stored underground. And it's able to aggressively shoot up and out everything that you see above ground. But this picture is a great representation of what it looks like in full growth. But it can make it difficult for management because you need to think about most of the system being underground, and anywhere that anywhere that a piece of the root could be transported or accidentally put in another oil soil area, it can establish itself and grow just as aggressively. Knotweed was actually introduced intentionally, starting in the UK. A German doctor who traveled to Japan thought that it was a beautiful plant. And it was in the 1800s. And at that time, there was a trend for gardening, similar to today, where instead of a manicured lawn, the trend was a little bit more of a wild space. But at that time, they didn't really put any thought into native plants or really the source of where their plants were coming from. So knotweed made a beautiful addition with these lovely creamy white flowers in a wild landscaped yard. So it was brought intentionally in the UK and really spread kind of aggressively over there. Now it's a significant issue. There's legislation in place that for private property that Japanese knotweed is present. If it spreads over into another landowner's property, it can be liable for removing that. There's also mortgage lenders that put certain requirements on homeowners who have knotweed in their yard when they're trying to sell their home. Here in the US, it also was introduced as an ornamental and grows in dense thickets, crowding out our native vegetation. It really likes to grow in riparian areas along stream banks and rivers. And they are sensitive ecosystems that have a lot of biological activity in a small area. There are layers of biodiversity, both above and underground, when you have a variety of things growing. But when Japanese knotweed comes in and outcompetes everything else, you really don't have that complex system in place. What we found on the island, especially on that northern end where it's really just knotweed, is because there's nothing else growing, the knotweed actually stabilizes the riverbank. And when we have gone in and tried to remove it, it has caused erosion whenever we've removed the knotweed from there. So you don't want knotweed there. You'd rather have a lot of other things growing, but because that's growing there, it's the only thing stabilizing it. It's kind of a complicated situation there, but provides stability. And bees and pollinators seem to really like the flowers. And knotweed makes a really nice honey. I've actually heard of some beekeepers in areas where knotweed has not yet really become an issue requesting seeds because they really want to try this lovely honey. So I would not recommend doing that. Knotweed is an annual perennial. Once it establishes in a space, it will grow every year and bloom every year. It starts growing around May, depending on the weather of that season, and blooms in August and September with these lacy cream colored flowers. There are a few varieties of knotweed that all sort of grow in the same place. There's giant knotweed, Japanese knotweed, and Bohemian or a hybridized knotweed. You can kind of tell the difference in this photo with the three different sizes. They have hollow stems that are kind of a watery stem, and they're green with purple or red splotches on it. The leaves grow in an alternate pattern that are spade or heart-shaped. We have another conservation area a few miles north of Sycamore Island called Barking Slopes. And it's steep wooded slopes with a lot of cliffs. And there is a significant spring wildflower population there, as well as a significant amount of all three varieties of knotweed. And this photo is from there. We have there's a team of biologists from the Carnegie Museum of Natural History who have studied the knotweed out there and are studying the relationship between the early leaf out of invasive plants and their impacts on the spring wildflowers there. So the management plan for Sycamore Island recommended a strategic approach, which would balance goals with our limited resources as a small nonprofit. Knotweed is resource intensive to manage successfully, so we identified specific goals. One being to generally increase diversity. Floodplain forests mainly have a canopy of silver maple, although it's called Sycamore Island. We do have some sycamores there, but it's primarily silver maple. So adding additional large canopy trees will help maintain the floodplain forest over a long-term basis, and just diversifying the understory. We also had a shorter term goal of opening the island to the public. At the time that this photo was taken, that's what a lot of the island looked like. It wasn't really safe to have the public come in and navigate. We didn't have an established trail. And because we had a lot of remnants from the marina, it wasn't safe to allow people to come and explore the space with all the knotweed there. One of the things that made management difficult or long-term control is because most of the riverbanks around Pittsburgh are covered with Japanese knotweed. So even if we were somehow able to remove every bit of it on the island, right across the back channel was a really established population. So it's absolutely inevitable that it would return to the island. And the plan recommended beginning with test plots and then expanding off of those. This map is from the management plan, and it shows the knotweed extent and kind of concentration. Everywhere that we have this kind of fishnet looking hash layer is where the thickest stands of knotweed were present. These photos are from the plan that kind of show the invaded areas, and most of the time it's just a wall of green knotweed. We utilized the test plots and began management on the southern end of the island, which is test plot 1. Near the bottom of the map, you can see there's a section that's separated off with that sort of gray rectangle, and that's the sunken barge that I mentioned. It kind of naturally just sort of cut off that bottom section of the island, and we don't really do any management in that space. There wasn't much knotweed there, and by keeping the public away from there and our management kind of left that space on its own. We noticed in the initial surveys that there was a diverse amount of birds in that area, so we kind of view it as just sort of the bird preserve. We have moved our management northward. You can see the largest populations are on the northern half of the island here. So once we figured out what worked in that first test plot, we've now focused moving towards the rest of the population of knotweed. And now we're primarily focusing on the northern end. We started out with a few test plots with a couple different methods. We tested an injection method, which involved injecting herbicide directly into the stalks. And we found it wasn't incredibly effective, but it was really resource intensive because you had to inject each stalk versus like a foliar herbicide application where you're sort of broadcasting a spray across an area. So with the amount that we had and the resources that we had available, it really wasn't turning out to be a sustainable approach. What we have used since about 2011 is a combination of mechanical or physical treatment. We don't actually use we use no machines. Everything that we take over to the island, we have to take over in a canoe. And we also use chemical treatment. So once the knotweed is about, I don't know, maybe waist high or so, sometime in between May, July, June is a pretty good season. If we can get there when it's dry, we go out and do a full cutting of the area that we intend to spray. So since there's not much else growing, it's pretty easy to clear the area, and it's easy to mobilize volunteers. You don't have to worry too much about accidentally cutting down something that they shouldn't have. So we cut, and ideally we cut twice during the growing season. And the intent with that is to put stress on that rhizome system, stress out that underground battery, so that the plant has to keep expending energy to regrow, so that the time we come in the end of the season and spray, it's already in a weakened state. There has been a good bit of research on Japanese knotweed. I should say there's been active research on Japanese knotweed over the last decade, especially in the UK, coming out of the University of Swansea. And there was a study published just earlier this year, led by Sophie Hawking. And the study compared 8 different methods of Japanese knotweed control. They looked at some physical methods, like using like a backhoe to completely dig it out. The challenge with that is, I mentioned that every piece of the root system could somehow reestablish itself. So if you're using a backhoe and just digging out the whole population, you need to put it in a landfill. They also looked at some like geotextile methods to cover it up, a geomembrane coverage, which is what is used whenever landfills are capped. And they compared some chemical treatment methods as well. So looking at what is the most sustainable method for treating knotweed, taking into account the amount of environmental, economic, and impacts and the time involved. And what they found is an annual application of glyphosate is the most sustainable right now, taking into account the current known impacts of glyphosate, which we know we won't really know the long-term effects until years from now. But that's what's coming out in most recent studies, is that this is still the most sustainable method of treatment. And we found it to be successful on the island. And each year we review our approach. We started out with a higher concentration of glyphosate and wanted to see if we could reduce the concentration to see if that was also effective. And we found that it was. So now we use a lower concentration. And usually after 2 years of this cycle of cutting and treating, we have almost like a 90% reduction in knotweed presence. And once an area is treated and restored, we still go back each year and survey it and do spot treatment as needed. Usually spot treatment might involve like a rogue tall stalk that appears, or it'll come back with like a small burst of growth that looks a lot like treasure troll hair. And we'll just go back and spot treat those as needed. But we found once an area really establishes with native growth, we don't have to go back and do a lot of broadcast spraying. So we track our treatment every year. We track the amount that we use, the area that we worked in, what it looks like. And once we got established with the test plot, we broke the island up into 3 primary management areas. And as I mentioned, we started in that southernmost test plot in B, and there were only a few clusters of knotweed. So once we got those under control, we've really spent most of our time in the last 8 years or so in C and D, where you can see with the black, that hash mark, that's where the biggest concentration was. IMAP invasives has been a really helpful tool for tracking. It's been easy to use. It has an easy to use mapping capability where we're able to actually draw out the area that we treated at any time, record when it was done, who did it, all the details of it. We also use a really long running Word document, but the benefit of IMAP invasives is you don't misplace that. It can be shared across your organization and across other communities. And we're able to kind of add it to a collective of invasive work. You can also survey areas through IMAP invasives and record a presence or a non-detection. So as we go back to the other areas that we treated, we can record surveys and have the time and the date, and who did the surveys and what the results were. Whatever sort of method someone's using for recording, first of all, I highly recommend you record everything that you're doing, both, for the benefit of yourself, for your staff or your volunteer group. It helps if there's any turnover in the organization, and also just to show the success of your work. But whatever method that you use, it's critical to maintain updating on it, just be consistent with it. Once you get behind a season or two, it's really difficult to go back and collect all that information and try to put that in. I know that from experience. So after that 2 cycle of treatment, where we have a huge reduction in knotweed presence, the area is pretty denuded. There's not much growing. So we come in that next season. We spray in the September. So we usually try that next spring to begin establishing new growth. We've planted over 800 trees, at least throughout the island, a mix of tall canopy trees, smaller understory trees, some herbs, but a large mix. A lot of them are bare root saplings. They do have some mortality, especially because the whole island floods, and we have some tough freezing conditions some years. And we don't use any deer protection on the island. Don't really need to. We will get a few deer over there, but not enough that we have any sort of deer pressure. And that's probably what has contributed to the island having a lot of just natural regeneration. There's a couple pioneer species that spread really easily. One of them is jewelweed. And actually in this picture, this is the pool. I'm not exactly sure how it was supposed to look whenever it was a functional pool, but we rehabbed it into a pond, and we've had a couple things living in there. We get frogs. One year we had a beaver, definitely had a big snapping turtle in there for a few seasons. But anyway, what is growing all around there is the jewelweed, and it has a propulsion dispersion method for the seeds, where if you have any pressure on the seed pod, they just explode. So they're able to grow really rapidly and spread rapidly. Unlike knotweed, they're a native species and their root system is not that same sort of rhizome structure. So they don't threaten the rest of the ecosystem, but they're great to establish and come in and compete with a knotweed. So time for some pictures. So this is the knotweed test plot in section B, which is that southernmost area just north of the barge. The barge can be seen best in the 2012 photo. It's that sort of flat thing running across the back of the photo. It's just kind of a big rusty metal hunk now. So in 2011, pre-treatment, just a whole lot of knotweed all over. And right after spraying in 2012, you can see a lot of the remaining like old growth stalks that are still there. But by April, there really isn't anything. Like leaf flooding washed a lot of those stalks away, but in April, it's almost like we're starting with nothing there. So in that season, we began planting. So we get a lot of trees donated. We are part of a hunter safety access program with the Game Commission. So we receive donated trees through them, also through a grant programs like the Tree Vitalize program. But whatever we can get, we put in the ground there. And by 2016, you can see we have some natural other growth coming in on the ground. We have grape, wild grape that comes in. Some Oriental bittersweet establishes as well. I don't think we have so much of that down here, but a good mix of ground cover in here. By 2020 and 2023, the saplings that we have put in are growing well. There is a sumac kind of right in the forefront of the photos there. I know there was a locust right in here as well. I had to move aside, but so we have a lot of diverse natural growth that's coming in place of the knotweed that was here. We review this every year, and this is where maybe 8 years ago, I was seeing those little treasure troll tufts and would treat those, but I rarely have to do any sort of touch-up treatment in this area. Section C is that sort of middle section. It was really dense and kind of centralized around the pool. In 2011, you can kind of see around the edge of the pool where we just had this thick growth of knotweed. And although these are from two different angles, I couldn't find two pictures from the same angle where the folks are standing in the second picture. Everything behind them in 2011 would have looked just like that growth next to the other pool. Now we have a lot of red bud in this area. Our land steward has a red bud and has a lot of volunteer growth. So wherever he has a new sapling growing, he'll bring one out and put it on the island. So in a few years, we should have a lot of really pretty purple blooms in the spring. There is an established canopy all throughout Section C, but in a lot of the island. And I think that has added to this natural regeneration, especially with the knotweed, with the jewelweed being able to expand. And we found in this Section C area that we put in some button bush and spice bush, and the spice bush has really taken off as well. So we have a lot of diverse things that are growing in there pretty well. So Section D is this northernmost area of the island that has less canopy. There's kind of one open section, and then at the far edge of the island, there's almost no canopy there. And this one is really where we put a lot of our time each year over the last several years. We didn't have a whole lot of jewelweed coming in as that natural competitor, and it's been slow to establish new growth here. So we're still using that same method of identifying an area, cutting it, spraying it, planting where we can, but we're allowing the natural regen to kind of come in through here. So it's just been a really slow process. And now as we're getting to the end of the island, we're trying to figure out how to address that where we don't have a lot of canopy, we don't have a lot of other things stabilizing the island. So now here we are, 12 years or so after starting management. And as we do every year, we're kind of asking ourselves questions. How do we continue to approach towards the end of the island, knowing that the knotweed that's there is stabilizing it. We experimented one year with clearing 6-foot sections along the edge all the way to the water's edge to see if we could kind of outcompete the knotweed. We've done a lot of willow stake planting and I've tried to put some other species in there. But sometimes what we run into is just sort of unpredicted weather conditions during the seasons. That year that we tried that, it was a really cold winter and we had a lot of ice damming. So in the sections that we opened up, we noticed some significant erosion. So we decided not to clear. We leave an 8-foot buffer of Japanese knotweed untouched on the edge and are just trying to really build up that center middle area. We tried planting sunflowers in there to add some competition. It was a poor year for planting seeds and we lost most of the seeds that year. And now I think we're going to try putting in some tree species that have more flexibility and strong roots. And we are seeing that there is other native growth coming in there, but it's just a really slow process. So we're just kind of seeing how we can utilize both methods to expand in that area. We're also looking at other invasives. There was a whole list of invasives to manage. We're seeing in some areas that Oriental bittersweet is coming in and kind of establishing itself on the forest floor. Sometimes it's coming in and taking over some of the saplings. We have a ton of poison ivy on the island, as well as some buckthorn and privet. We did a couple focus removal of privet, just because there wasn't a whole lot of it, and it can get pretty aggressive as well. So now trying to see how does the knotweed management fit in with other invasives as we're having invasives come in and establish in some of the areas that we have managed for knotweed. How do we address those? And when looking at that, you can't treat every plant the same way. You have to then look at what's appropriate for managing that plant. We know what is the best method for us right now for management, but as more research is done, as technology advances, as people get more innovative, maybe we discover another treatment method that is more appropriate, especially for the riverbanks. Maybe there's something we could be doing differently in that area. We also ask ourselves, when do we stop this active management of the Japanese knotweed? Every year we have to expend resources to manage it. We have to mobilize volunteers. We have to utilize staff time, equipment, herbicide. So we go back to our goals for the space and think about how have we met those? And then how long do we remain active managing the knotweed? Can we ever fully manage it to the full extent? So just kind of asking those questions. Again, you want to reevaluate what you're doing every year, but now that we're kind of at over a decade of this, it's a good time to think about what are we going to be doing for the next 10 years here. So in thinking about your own invasive management strategy, just putting some questions out here of how to, what to ask yourself whenever you're faced with perhaps your own giant stand of knotweed or other invasive. First is, what is the goal? We had a couple of specific goals mentioned. We had a short-term goal of allowing safe access on the island. So we needed to be able to clear a trail, clear out all the areas that someone could get injured on these old pieces of metal, and then be able to maintain that, because we don't have staff, we don't have rangers or anyone that are out on the property often. So we needed it to be able to be a low maintenance in maintaining that space as well for the public. And then our larger goal of just overall increasing diversity. We're probably overdue for a really comprehensive plant survey on the island, but just through our annual observations, seeing what we've planted there and how it's been surviving, I can definitely say we've significantly increased biodiversity from the existing knotweed presence that was there when we began. When you're thinking about your goals, you need to think about your timeline. If you have a short timeline for what you want to achieve, it's probably going to impact the amount of resources you need to work within that timeline. And honestly, sometimes the timeline isn't in your control. Like I mentioned, sometimes different weather conditions, you know, COVID, a variety of things can come in and complicate things. So just keeping in mind a desirable timeline, but it isn't always something you can manage. It's also important to think about how you measure success. When I first started managing invasives, my understanding was successful invasive management was completely removing any non-native species and replacing it with diverse natives. This is still totally true. This is what we do. But overall, we have a changing climate. And in about 80 years from now, if we stay on track, the globe stays on track with how it currently is, Pittsburgh, PA is going to feel a lot like Southern Texas. So plants that were native here 150 years ago may not be doing as well 100 years from now. And that's not to say that you should not plant natives or that you should go planting exotics or whatever it is that you want. But you do need to think about how the site will look in the future, plant for survival, and again, what your initial goal is. Is there a specific species that you're trying to develop or improve habitat for? Or are there higher quality areas adjacent to the knotweed that you can access for growth or allow for some natural migration of what is already surviving and that can already migrate? Nowadays, I feel like restoration is a bit of an experiment, and you have to look at what you're doing every year. And although it's somewhat prescriptive, successful management is a moving target. We are a nonprofit, like I said, with 2.5 staff in our stewardship department. We're lucky enough to have a land steward who has dedicated volunteer hours here every year since 2011 to help monitor and manage the site and keep us on track. We also work to mobilize groups of volunteers every year. If you don't have access to volunteers, or you're not in an organization that uses volunteers, you need to think about the additional cost of services to do the treatment and other resources that may be required to do the management at all and meet your goals that you've set out. Scale impacts that resource and everything else that you're doing as well. The island here is somewhat isolated, 14 acres. We don't manage Japanese knotweed on every property, and we don't manage invasives on every property. This photo is from the property I mentioned called Barking Slopes. In this area, trillium grows really well under the knotweed, as well as a variety of other ephemeral spring wildflowers. Because of the growth pattern, they're able to go through their cycle before the knotweed really begins growing and overcrowding it. So when we look at an area like that, it has a significant amount of knotweed there as well. But from an organizational standpoint, we look at whether it's appropriate to go in and actively manage that. Right now, we're not managing the knotweed there. There are recommendations for invasive plant management for removing knotweed and other invasives. Penn State Extension and DCNR all have really great resources for learning what methods for removal or control. But individually, you need to develop your management strategy for your specific site and your specific goals. And you have to evaluate it regularly and evolve as needed to match your organization and kind of what's going on with your site. Alrighty, well, thank you all for listening. And I think I see some questions coming in. So Amy, if you got them for me.
Yes, and thank you so much, Caitlin. That was super interesting. And I just have to say, I was super interested to hear about the native range of the knotweed and how it prefers the active volcanoes. I think that explains a lot.
Yeah, right?
So thank you for mentioning. Um, so yeah, we'll start going through some questions. Caitlin, early on, and I think like slide 4 or 5, you had a picture of what looked like a turtle with a really interesting snout on it. And we had a question asking, what was that?
Oh, I'm gonna get in trouble if my volunteers are here that I can't remember what it is. Um, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I will have to get back to you on that because I forgot what it was.
No worries, no
But you
worries.
know
It'll
what?
come to you probably at question 5.
You could find it if you go to iNaturalist, because we record lots of observations of things on there. And there's a project for Sycamore Island, and you can see photos and observations of all the different living things that have been observed there, including that turtle and its name.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Well, thank you for that. We had a question from Jared. He's saying, do you just leave the cuttings of knotweed when you cut twice in the growing season? And are there concerns of the clippings spreading elsewhere?
Sure. Nope. We leave them. We leave them right there. Um, a lot of times when we cut, and especially if we're doing like a second round of cutting, they lay kind of right on top of old growth. You kind of get this layer of dried old stalks that they're on top of. So there's a bit of a separation between what's laying there and the soil. And because we're coming in later and treating, we yeah, we don't worry too much about it spreading, and we haven't noticed that happening.
Okay, great. Good to know. Thank you. We had a question from Elise. She was saying, has anyone done trials with strictly mechanical control rather than glyphosate?
Yeah, unintentionally, we've had a year where we did not spray. Actually, last year we did not spray, and what we find is when you cut it, it just kind of comes back. You can, like, if you have some in your yard, you could theoretically mow it just to keep it down, but it won't remove it completely. And once the plant kind of feels that there's stress coming from above, the roots will start to kind of shoot out from the sides. So long term, it won't remove it.
Okay, thank you. Good to know. Question from Tim. He's saying, I may have missed it, but are you doing a foliar spray for herbicide? How long after a second cutting would you need to wait to spray? And can you clarify that a 2-a-year cutting treating timeline?
Sure. So we do a foliar spray. We use backpack sprayers with a light mist. And when we don't, for some years, we've only done one cutting where we haven't had resources available, and we do that in June. For 2 rounds of cutting, I'd probably come in for that first cut around June, maybe that second cut, maybe late July or August. But you want to give the knotweed enough time to grow up maybe almost like waist height or so. But you want enough time after that second cutting for it to grow again to about waist height or so, because you want the plant to put out enough energy again, and you want enough leaf growth for the foliar application.
Right, absolutely. And that makes sense. Okay, great. Thank you. So we had a question from Eric. He's asking about restoration. Is the restoration planting happening after year 1 of treatment or year 2?
Year 2, if we're going in for like a new and really thick, um, you know, dense thicket, where we have to do 2, because sometimes after that first year, we're still faced with kind of a wall of knotweed. It's just thinner, and then we don't want to plant where we may be coming in and doing a foliar treatment again. If we
Right.
can get that clear out within 1 year and we don't, then we're at a point we're doing spot treatment after 1 year, we'll go ahead and begin planting.
Okay. Laura was asking, what about rabbits and groundhogs? Any grazing pressure from those?
No, I know that there are some furry creatures that come out there. We think we based on the photos of scat that I've taken or seen, we may have some raccoons, but anything that's over there has to swim across the back channel. So we don't have a whole lot of activity, a whole lot of pressure. We did have beaver at one point, but that was several years ago and they haven't come back.
Okay, and the island is obviously a very kind of niche location that maybe that wouldn't always be, there would be a concern in other places, but not necessarily on the
Absolutely.
island. Yeah, okay. We may have addressed this in another question, but I just want to make sure I ask it just in case. From Jared, is there any reason you do not plant the same fall season, like October, after herbiciding?
Yeah, we usually would plant. So we would spray in September and plant that following spring. And now our plantings, when we first started treatment, we kind of would clear out a large area and then would come in with fresh planting. Now everything is moving so slowly that as we're treating, what we're planting is kind of in the back, the section that we had previously treated maybe the year before, and are just sort of inching along there. But it would be that following spring that we would begin planting.
Okay, great. Tally's asking about goats. Have heard a lot about using goats to help control knotweed. Any reason that wasn't investigated as an option? Is it because it would be hard to get the herd over there and or any other reasons?
We did not utilize goats and we haven't used goats just due to financial restrictions. We haven't been successful in getting a grant, and goats are expensive. But we'd love to have goats there, and I'm sure we'd have many volunteers willing to be the goat herder on the island for us if needed.
That would be really cool. Let's see. Laura Gish was asking about Oriental bittersweets. She's saying it's a big problem in her area in South Central Pennsylvania and Cumberland County. Do you plan to control that as well? I can't remember if you said that was present on the island or not.
Yes, it is present. And it is not as huge of an area as huge of an issue here, but we have other properties that it is a significant issue, especially as it gets up into the canopy. What we're doing so far is just making sure that anywhere that the bittersweet is getting up into trees and starting to move its way up into the higher canopy, that we're cutting it, but we haven't activated any like chemical treatment for it. And right now it's kind of widespread in an area along the ground that would require like a lot of hand pulling. So for now, we're just trying to keep it out of the canopy. I know in areas where it's really significantly established and taken over canopies, we've had a site where we went in and we did some selective clear cutting to open up the canopy and allow for better treatment and removal of the bittersweet. But that one is another beast for sure.
Yeah, and it all probably aligns with the goals, I'm sure, that you kind of put together at the very beginning with your management plan, because you only have, you have limited resources and capacity. So
It's definitely something that I have a growing concern about, but we're not too sure what we're doing with it yet.
sure. Okay, thank you. We have about a minute left and the questions keep coming in. So I'll just mention really quick for any questions we don't get to today. Caitlin's contact information is here on the screen, so feel free to reach out to her with your questions if we don't get a chance to get to yours specifically today. So we had a question from Laura. She's asking, how often does the island flood and what does that change?
Well, it kind of depends on the season, but it floods every year. And it's part of the natural ecosystem there. it doesn't really change anything because the island has always kind of been that way. It's adapted to it.
Okay. And we'll do one last question here. We'll wrap it up from Maureen. She's asking, are there any special considerations or different tactics you would recommend for homeowners trying to control knotweed on residential properties?
Depends on the size. Yeah. So here we don't, I mentioned in the UK that they have legislation and it creates major issues for, mortgage lenders. we don't have that there. So we don't have, specific requirements where you have to do anything to it. And on its own, in your backyard, the biggest threat that it has is it's an inconvenience in the yard. So you don't have to have as much of an aggressive approach to it. But it's other than just if you are a homeowner and using glyphosate, make sure you do your research. The work that we're doing, we have a certified applicator, a licensed applicator overseeing all of our work. So as a homeowner, just make sure you're really well informed. You're using, good resources for the information and guiding your practices.
Absolutely. Great response. Well, sorry, we couldn't get to all the other questions that we saw coming in here today. But again, please feel free to reach out to Caitlin with your question. And again, Caitlin, thank you so much for this fantastic information and great job on the obviously very hard work that you and others have invested in protecting that particular natural resource here in the Pittsburgh region. So thank you so much. And yeah, thanks for your presentation. It was wonderful. So, and
Great.
I'll be sending out a recording for today's presentation a little bit later today or tomorrow, hopefully. So look for that and feel free to share out as you would like. So thanks everybody and have a great rest of your day.
Great. Thanks everyone.